Hey there, good evening. Nice to see you. It's time for the Bronx Buzz. This is Bronx Net's program where we talk to reporters, writers, editors, journalists, people who write op-ed pieces, which is a foreshadowing of our second segment today. But we're going to start out with a foremost journalist, and he's actually just written an incredibly great piece about one part of the Bronx. And so it's our longtime friend and associate, deputy editor of City Limits, David Brand. Hi, Dave.
Hey, Gary.
Nice to have you with us.
Thanks.
Let's just get started. Which actually came out today, the day that we're recording this program. This story about the Just Home project, and you took a look at it at the point of view that the formerly incarcerated who need care need to have a place to go, and you pointed up the kind of opposition that we're seeing there from the community. How do you see this from your perspective after you did all that research and interviewing, et cetera? What do you think? I'm going to tell you editorially, for me, I think it's hard to deny this project. I think we need it, but you can say whatever you want.
Well, there's a member of the community, Roxanne Delgado, who kind of makes that same point. And I talked with her in the story, and she's been pretty vocal. And she also did an op-ed for us at City Limits saying, like, it's kind of hypocritical to oppose this project because it's supportive housing for people who are leaving jails, either awaiting trial or they have served their sentence, they've paid their debt to society and now need a place to stay. And so how can people both oppose shelters in the area as well as the solution to homelessness? And that's this supportive housing project. So it's 70 units, 50 of them would be reserved for formerly incarcerated individuals. Another 20 would be for low-income community members. It's fully contained on the grounds of Jacoby Hospital. It's in a vacant staff residence. And yet the opposition is fierce. And that's what a lot of the story focus on. Like, you walk around Indian Village neighborhood, pretty much every yard has a sign saying, not here, not now, not ever, opposing the project. There's a lot of fear, a lot of discrimination, a lot of, I think, misinformation about what this project is.
That's where I was going to go about partially misinformation, and to me that's part of, which is why I really appreciated the work that you did, because two things I will say. Number one, what happens to those people if you don't do this? And then it did come out. Ms. Delgado mentioned it in your article. It did come out very clearly that if you don't do this, you can't be complaining about people sleeping in the street or other issues, and going into an emergency room where people don't know what else to do, so they're hurt or they're sick, and here's a chance to do it within a confined, quote unquote, confined place. Do you have the sense that, because one of the things that's out there is they're going to be wandering in our neighborhood? I have this sense, as opposed to maybe some other projects, it's in the Jacoby Medical Center, area. So is there any reality to that? Or, I mean, I don't want to just dismiss their claims, but I'm trying to find the logic in it personally.
I guess, it's possible, I guess. There's a wall and a fence that separate the campus from the neighborhood of Indian Village. And then the only way out, I guess, would be to go onto Pelham Parkway. But, people are concerned. This is kind of like supercharging the normal concerns people often have about new development, especially new low-income housing development, because of people coming in are formerly incarcerated. And so that leads immediately to opponents saying, would you want murderers in your neighborhood? Would you want rapists in your neighborhood? But that's kind of taking the very worst case scenario and applying a broad brush to people who will be living there. So
there is a lot of fear out there. As far as when it gets approved, whether it gets approved, you didn't get a quote from Councilmember Velasquez. She is traveling, and that's understandable. This is the time of year that she's going to do that. But there were many people in the community upset because after saying she opposed the Bruckner development, she ultimately signed off on the deal. So I guess it remains to be seen. At the moment, she's scheduled to come on Bronx Talk right after the first of the year.
Nice.
Maybe we'll have some answers, but it's also possible schedules change. I mean, I don't want to promise anything. I want to add on to the dialogue here today you're writing about Mayor Adams ordering the removal of people who are deemed mentally ill. I think there's, in part, a relationship between these. The idea is the mayor has looked at homeless people who are mentally ill, some of them committing crimes. I mean, this is not a good thing to have people who are not well and maybe not safe wandering our streets. And now his idea is we're simply going to take them off the streets. We're going to involuntarily put them in hospitals or other places. This is a has been a challenging concept
Mhm.
for the mayor. What do you make of it? Is it possible to do this and make it work?
I think the issue is so deep that a lot of the criticism that this plan is facing is that it really only scratches the surface of moving people out of public spaces temporarily and taking them to hospitals, when
Mm,
a lot of people have pointed out that one of the main issues is that hospitals will quickly discharge people or won't admit people at all, even if they
yeah.
are
You got a
uh,
broken leg and you think you're going to stay for a couple of days.
yeah,
Forget that.
yeah.
Let alone a much less easy to diagnose situation.
Exactly. And so then what happens? Someone is taken to the hospital. Maybe they are admitted for 72 hours, discharged. Maybe they're
Yeah,
not admitted at all. They're discharged immediately. What happens? Right back on the streets, right back on the subway. So it's a more complex issue that demands more comprehensive response when it comes to better shelter services, ultimately more housing, more supportive housing. Like you mentioned, the connection between these two articles is the supportive housing connection. And so right now, New York City has about
that's right.
2,600 vacant supportive housing apartments that take a long time to fill. And for whatever reason, because of bureaucratic obstacles, because nonprofits can kind of pick and choose who they want to house in those sites, takes a long time. And on many instances, the people most in need are not getting the housing that they
That's
need.
right. You interviewed Stephen Banks, who has a long history in serving the homeless community in this city, and he, I think, correctly said, "Well, this is one thing, but the process." And David, you deal with this every day, of supportive housing, proper housing, affordable housing, and it has to have some kind of service component. What if
Mhm.
you have somebody who's kind of acting out but is not specifically dangerous, and you're getting the police involved? It starts
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
Yeah, I'll just throw this out. The mayor was a police officer, and when he looks at solutions, this is how he sees the world. I mean,
yeah.
that's what they did when they moved the homeless. How did that homeless encampment thing work out? Where they took apart homeless encampments. I know they got accused of taking people's property,
Mhm.
but did they find that people ended up in shelters or in better situations?
In a small number of cases, people did agree to enter shelter, but I think in most cases, people didn't, and so becomes just moving people along to the next place and the next place. And there was some data that recently came out. Organization Safety Net Project got it through Freedom of Information Law, shared it with Gothamist for a story, and I think one site was targeted like 90 times this year, just
Wow.
continuing, continuing,
Is
continuing to.
it and you know what that is also, again, for me, even editorial, it's difficult for me to hear, maybe for a lot of people to hear. It makes the people who have very difficult lives more difficult. So they trying to get themselves even situated, and I'm not saying it's acceptable or not acceptable, but this is what they've had to do. They get situated in a little encampment by the East Side drivers, by the FDR Drive, and all of a sudden that's moved out. Then they got to go find another highway that they're going to live under because the shelter system is not working. Along with that, I mean, this just goes on and on. You wrote a story about empty rent stabilized units in New York City decreasing this year, but the warehousing debate uh, rages. Let's talk a little bit about that before we run out of time. The number of empty apartments matches the vacancy rate prior to the landmark 2019 tenant protections. Where are we at? To me, the first part of that sounded like it was good news, you know?
Yeah, that's why this is such a complicated issue because
That's
if
exactly right.
you again, I know
I'm
it's like
trying. I'm
it's like
working on it, Dave.
can we just have some easy solutions here, Gary? This is like too everything's so complex. But yeah, so a few weeks ago, the news site The City reported on the 2021 vacancy report, rent stabilized apartment vacancy report, which was based on 2020 data. And it showed that the number of vacant apartments, rent stabilized apartments, had really spiked to around 61,000. And then New York City Housing Agency said, actually, it's closer to 90,000. So that
Wow.
got people really upset. Like,
Yeah.
we have a housing crisis. How can we possibly have all these
Empty
vacancies?
about.
The more recent data for April of 2022 shows that the rate of vacancies has decreased to pre-pandemic and even pre-2019 levels, showing that that was probably an anomaly based on wealthier people from Manhattan moving out, as we all saw during the
Right.
pandemic, and they live in buildings that are rent stabilized. The rents are very high because the buildings receive the 421A tax subsidy. So, all that's to say is that data was used for many different political
Just to
means.
be clear, so we have some of that vacancy is gone, but it almost revealed the fact that some of these rent stabilized apartments were not being used for people who really needed it, but people who did have a little bit of excess and
Yeah,
had the wherewithal during the
yeah,
pandemic to leave the city.
yeah, yeah.
Um, so that's where we're at, and then what then becomes the status of those apartments? Are they being transferred to people who need it to help ease the housing crunch, or are we in the situation where basically replacing one, frankly, well-to-do person with another?
Yeah. Well, that's why this is such a hot issue because
Yes.
those 421A apartments might have been built 4 years ago and maybe have a rent of $10,000, but they're considered rent stabilized. But yet they kind of get, if you just look at bulk data, they get grouped into the more traditional rent stabilized apartments, which are pre 1974 buildings, many cases very low rents, very low income people living in them, and so when you look at the bulk data, there's not much distinction.
Right.
And yet that bulk data gets used by landlord groups saying, see,
See, yep. Oh, man.
we want to bring these apartments back online, but we
Right,
can't because we can't afford it. We need to change the
right,
rent
right,
laws.
right.
And then you have renter groups saying how horrible this is, that we're in a housing shortage and you're withholding apartments from us.
Got it.
You need to be
Dave
penalized. So
Dave, we got to move on. I can't tell you how important your work is to all of us in the
thank
Bronx
you,
and in
Gary.
the city of New York. It's thorough, it's well researched. We need you. Thank you for everything you do. Deputy editor of City Limits. Check out citylimits.org and make sure you read David Brand and all the other great writers that work there. Thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, Gary. It's great.
Okay, we will take a short break, and then the head of a national not-for-profit that's dealing with homeless students in our public schools. So we'll be right back.
¿Qué color? Perfecto, mijo.
Gracias. Thank you.
What's wrong, mijo? Donating to a pet's medical care is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
Man, it's lonely. Like, going through life lonely.
There is the therapeutic aspect of music, just expressing how you feel. I'm going to talk to Howie about his feelings, make it into a song.
Is it time yet?
It's time.
Gonna start time for dinner.
Oh, terrific.
Pasta dinner.
Donating pet food is one of the many ways you can help families in your community. Pets and people belong together. Learn more at petsandpeopletogether.org.
Okay, back with you on the Bronx Buzz. Thank you to David Brand for his fine work. And we're going to switch gears and say a good evening to the Executive Director of the Urban Resource Institute. It is Mr. Nathaniel Fields. Mr. Fields, nice to have you with us, sir.
Gary, thank you so much for having me and doing the story today.
Uh, you wrote what as soon as I saw it, I said, well, we've got to have him on the show. He wrote this op-ed piece for Gotham Gazette that said homeless children in New York City need more help to recover from trauma. I'll give a little background and then you can talk a little bit about what what your piece was about and why you were motivated to write it. We have learned that there are over 104,000 children in our public school system who are homeless. And the thought of them doing their homework, dealing with the train, not having a place to live, who knows what the family structure might or might not be like. It is 10% of the system. They're experiencing homeless. If you look at 35 kids, that means 3 or 4 children in every single classroom are homeless. And I love our teachers. They've got to deal with it. I could go on, Mr. Fields. I guess my frustration is the same thing that motivated you to write that op-ed piece.
Gary, thanks for setting the table as you just did. And not only me, right? The work that we do at Urban Resource Institute is transformational. We work to end domestic and gender-based violence, and we work with homeless families. We're actually the largest provider of domestic violence shelter services in the country. So when you hear other groups like the American Academy of Pediatrics declaring a national emergency for children as it relates to mental health, it needs to get our attention. And this has been percolating since well over the last decade, where we've seen the evidence and the data and working with young people, increased rates of thinking about hurting themselves, loneliness, anxiety, and of course, suicide from 2010 and 2018.
And let me just interject. So look at those factors that you just mentioned, which without a doubt are what 100,000 children are going through. And then add in the pressures of growing up in an urban place, of coming into school, of wanting to achieve, but not having the same resources maybe that some of the other, and I'm not talking about rich or poor, we're talking about people who live in lower and middle classes, and those children don't even have those resources. I don't even know what to say. So what do you do? What can you do to work with these children and work with these families to help them get to a point of stability?
Yeah, and Gary, it's so important to say that because I think New Yorkers can connect going through the pandemic together and the impact of the pandemic just on children. And you just talked about, and that was hard in and of itself. And then, of course, children who've been impacted by homelessness and domestic violence. So it's even more work and more challenges in terms of how do we support these individuals? And we know as a community, we need to, because when you think about the overwhelming number of individuals in homeless shelters, and people don't realize this because they often see a single person, often male, often a person of color on the street, and they think that's the face of homelessness. You and I know that children are the face of homelessness in New York City, right? The overwhelming majority of individuals who are homeless are children. So what have we been doing? What are we doing?
And then in the long run, then what is the future for? So, okay, they get through school. Maybe they get through high school. I mean, you talked about some of the devastating things, even suicide. Maybe if they get through high school, I mean, my hat's off for kind of surviving that. But then what is their future? I mean, it seems hard to figure out how you can build that child up. So what do? You get into the schools, you provide services for the kids, because it's not only the children. Of course, these are trickle-down issues with housing, start there, not to mention various employment issues for the family. And then, of course, the children need such support and care. So what do you guys do, and what did you propose in that op-ed piece that you think should resonate?
Yeah. And everyone should read that op-ed piece.
Yes.
So here's the deal. This is what we've been doing, and this is what we want to do more of. We realize that we have a great opportunity to work with children who are in school who've been impacted by homelessness or impacted by other issues just generally. So in partnership with New York City, we started the Relationship Abuse Prevention Program, dubbed RAP. It allows us to go into New York City schools, both middle schools and high schools, and work with the young people to understand what a healthy relationship looks like.
Relationship between them and their peers, or even them and their teachers?
Between them and their peers, relationship between them and their family members, domestic violence, right? Intimate partner relationships, as well as family relationships. And then build tools to be able to identify it. And then we support them in understanding if they're experiencing abuse, how to get help and support to reduce, to eliminate that abuse, and to build a culture where they don't tolerate abuse. So we work with social workers, trained social workers in middle schools and high schools, where we touch about 40,000 students each
Wow.
year.
Congratulations.
Big numbers, right? Big numbers.
Those are big numbers. And do you work in groups, like you said, in a classroom? Do you create special sessions? Do you do it after school? Are these curricular kinds of things? How do you actually, reach the children or start there? Or do you bring in mom and dad as well? I mean, what do you do?
It is in that school a community, right? We have other resources in that school with other counselors and teachers. And what we do, it's New York City schools, because space is always a premium.
Yes.
And so we really identify safe spaces in each of the schools or campuses we're on. And we work to make sure that RAP is well known in the school. And then we work with young people individually and in groups. And what's even as exciting, we have young people learning and becoming peer experts. So they're leading these groups with other peers. And you know how powerful it is. One peer who has the right information is engaging another peer. So individuals and groups and young people really talking about healthy relationships and building support. And the reason I'm talking about domestic violence and homelessness, because we know domestic violence, when you go to homeless shelters, homeless family shelters, a lot of individuals there would say, hey, I was driven here because of domestic violence.
Because of a problem in the home.
Right. And we have our own domestic violence shelter system in New York City. We have the homeless system, what many people know about. Not so many people know that we have a dedicated shelter system focused only on victims of domestic and gender-based violence.
When you do this, and you've done so much study of it and research of it, but things always come up, and certainly with children, you're going to hear stuff that you hadn't anticipated. I know you're not in every classroom, but what are the counselors saying? Is there anything out there that surprises you and says, I kind of didn't know that the kids might say this? Or is it pretty much you understand fully what's going on out here? Like, is there a trend maybe that we might not be aware of?
Each school has its own sort of subculture.
Its own culture,
right?
Right. Yeah.
I'm amazed by our RAP coordinators, those social workers in school, because they're, of course, trained, licensed social workers. They know how to engage students. They know how to help them feel safe, to have them build trust. And then in that trust, to really talk about what's happening in their home and what's happening in their community, because we talk about violence in and of itself. What surprises me is how come we don't have RAP programs in every schools, even the Bronx, right? When you think about a lot that's happening in the Bronx, we know the Bronx has been under-resourced, right? The mayor talks about that, your Bronx borough president.
We talk about it every day.
That's right. So why wouldn't we talk about, when the mayor talks about, let's deal with the challenges downstream, invest in prevention like RAP, let's put RAP in every middle school or junior high school, or let's even pilot it where we have data where we have a lot of domestic violence in certain zip codes, and start to look at intervening in the most effective way.
That what that reminds me of is the the CompStat, which was such a revelation, where they analyzed crime in different neighborhoods, and it really was a very good tool to solve or at least address those kinds of problems and put resources in it, it would be real nice to break down this horrible homeless thing and then really look at neighborhoods. I'm just curious. You mentioned Bronx schools. And do you have a number? How many you're in? I mean, I don't know how you want to characterize what's there and what is still needed to be done.
Yeah, I would say in working with the mayor's office to end domestic and gender-based violence, we are only in a few schools in the Bronx. What we
Right.
want to do is to look at the data. We can take New York City's fatality review report that's put out every year and look at the homicides that are taking place in those communities, and then be able to target those schools in those communities.
Right.
Say,
And
hey, let's have rap
I
there.
got it. You're right on it, because now with the new policy toward dealing with mentally ill homelessness, and they're dealing with that, and they're going to assess neighborhoods in different areas and attack that. Why aren't we doing the same thing in our schools and saying which Bronx schools are having these kinds of issues, maybe more so than others, and then put the resources in to deal with it? I mean, that's basically what the outreach is here, right?
Right. And we know how cost effective it is, because if we don't deal with these issues early, like with our early rap, where we work with middle school and rap in general, we know that looking at the data over time, that over 50% of individuals impacted by domestic violence will more than likely be a perpetrator, do harm to someone they care about,
Of
or
course.
receive harm from somebody.
That's right.
And we
And
don't. So let's invest now. Let's
and
invest downstream.
I vote yes. Put it on the ballot. Gary will vote yes. And really, that's that's what we're all missing so often, is you got to put the resources in from the beginning, and the numbers are all there to show that children who are in these situations are just the future is cloudy. Let's put it that way. Listen, Mr. Fields, if schools, let's say, are watching and their principals are watching, or they want to, others who say, "Hey, we'd like to get you into our school," how should they get to you? What should they do?
They should go to our URINYC.org. We have an events page, information page there. They can contact us. They can dial our main number, and they can contact us at 646-588-0030 to reach URINYC.org is the best way. So if those principals, Gary, are watching, they should reach out to us, go to our website. They can find us. And if the mayor's watching, let's not only do the schools, let's look at shelters where we have an overwhelming number of children.
So you can
Let's
do
put
the
rap in
same.
those
You can do
shelters.
the same kind of program in the shelters.
We can do the same program in the shelters.
Nathaniel Fields, Executive Director at Urban Resource Institute. Thank you for everything you do. I mean,
And thank you for what you do.
We need it like we need blood that runs through our veins. Thank you so much. Folks, that'll do it for the Bronx Buzz this evening. Happy holidays to everyone. And we'll see you next week. Thanks to David Brand and, of course, to Nathaniel Fields. Good night. See you.